Now, by midnight tonight, all companies with more than 250 staff must reveal their average pay figures to show the difference between male and female employees. The Prime Minister has vowed to tackle what she's described as the burning injustice of the gender pay gap. Of the more than 9,000 firms that have reported so far, this is what the figures show. 78% of companies pay men more on average than they pay women. 13% pay women more than men. And just 8% say they have no pay gap at all. Our business correspondent Simon Gompertz reports.
The pay gap revealed for all to see. 72% at Ryanair. Individual employers being shown up, a 37% gap at British Gas, some of the worst in finance and construction, women getting 44% less at Barclays Bank. Another bank, TSB, has a 24% gap, but that's still big. And the question is, why?
The reason we have a gender pay gap is not because we have an equal pay issue. We pay men and women in the same jobs the same amount. However, we do have more women in more junior roles, typically in our branches, and more men in senior roles. Now, what that means to us is figuring out how we fix that problem of getting more women into senior roles.
But also the gap between the sort of high-level aspiration.
To these women working in the City of London, lawyers, insurance experts and bankers, it's right that every company has to come clean.
In order to galvanise change, you need data and you need to be having that conversation inside the organisation.
It's unfair for women, but unfortunately, they live it day in and day out quietly. It's not surprising.
I hope this is the start of more people having uncomfortable conversations.
Some big high street names, Costa and Starbucks, say they don't have a gap. Also McDonald's. So will the others face some sort of punishment?
It is against the law to pay one gender, and usually it's women, less for a similar job of work. But the information that companies are rushing to submit before the deadline tonight is an average across a number of different jobs within an organisation. Now, they could get into trouble with the courts if they submit it incorrectly or late, but beyond that, the government is hoping that exposing and shaming the worst ones will spur employers into dealing with the problem.
Well, I think the difference it'll make is that people looking to work for organisations can readily access what their gender pay gaps are, and actually organisations themselves who want to close the gender pay gap have now got the opportunity.
This technology and consultancy firm has eliminated gender pay differences by having women in half its senior roles, despite frequently caring for children or elderly relations as well.
Often women have to come back on a part-time basis. Employers have to be cognizant of this and have to be much more flexible, I believe, in order to shift the dial.
And Diageo, the company which sells Guinness and also Smirnoff vodka, has the opposite pay gap. Women are 10% ahead of men. The more that happens, the more the average will move in the right direction. Simon Gompertz, BBC News.
And just to tell you, you can look up the gender pay gap at any organisation that's released its figures on the website. There it is, bbc.co.uk/business. And that is the calculator there. You can just put in any company name.
As the UK's biggest companies have until midnight tonight to disclose their own gender pay gaps. If they don't meet the deadline, legal action and unlimited fines may follow. Sky's Adele Robinson reports.
Dividing up wages is straightforward for Geeta. In her detox juicing business, she says there's no gender pay gap. Employees are paid based on role.
I was a corporate lawyer, and I remember just always thinking you could never catch up. You just couldn't, no matter what you did, how good you were, you just never ever caught up because you weren't a man, you know, and how do you fight that? And why would you want to? And I just, after a while, thought, I'm not doing this. I'm going to do it my way.
The deadline's looming for businesses to report their figures. So far, these are the top 5, with the worst median pay gap in favour of men. The biggest stands at 95%. Then there's the top 5 with the largest gap in favour of women, with 85.2% the biggest. And the largest employers reporting no gender pay gap at all, among them Costa and Poundworld. But there are concerns the data isn't reflecting reality for some, like Ryanair, which says its 71.8% pay gap is down to the fact over 500 of its pilots are male and only 8 are female.
The data that's being produced by these new pay gap reporting measures is essentially useless because it looks across organizations and doesn't break down comparable jobs, comparable roles, age, experience, background, time taken off work. It tells us very little about equality between men and women in the workplace.
Writing in the Telegraph, the Prime Minister outlined her commitment to change. She said, "It seems extraordinary to us that women 100 years ago were not only denied the right to vote, but had to fight so hard for it. It's our job to make sure that it doesn't take another 100 years for the gender pay gap to become a thing of the past."
I think that it's going to open the whole can of worms, and hopefully, that there is equality.
I think it's a good starting point to build the visibility and build the transparency.
It makes things a lot more awkward for companies that they've got to discuss it.
Gender mix may be partly behind some reasons for the pay gap, but overall, Geeta says it's discrimination and its true scale across the UK is about to be revealed.
Yum.
Adele Robinson, Sky News.
And later on All That Politics, we're going to hope to speak to the Shadow Equalities Minister, Dawn Butler, and we will definitely be speaking to Dame Helena Morrissey, founder of the 30% Club, which aims to have women making up 30% of boardroom positions.
Now, the Prime Minister's vowed to tackle the gender pay gap. Theresa May has described the difference in earnings between men and women as a burning injustice. The UK's biggest companies have until midnight to disclose their figures. If they don't meet that deadline, they could be threatened with legal action and unlimited fines. Let's get more on this with Sky's Sally Lockwood live in Manchester for us at the headquarters of tech company UK Fast. Are they happy to give all that data to the government?
Well, they've been very happy to speak to us about their data today, and they've shared their figures with the government in the last 24 hours as well. But they are fairly critical in terms of how some of these figures are being represented and how they're being compared. Indeed, this company also says that it doesn't actually go far enough. Even though they have a 0% pay gap when it comes to the baseline of salaries, and they have a small pay gap when it comes to mean and median salary comparison, they say that actually it doesn't reveal what many are saying, criticising today, is it doesn't reveal pay equality. It doesn't reveal the difference between how men and women are paid doing the same jobs. Now, let me just introduce Trish Keating, who works on inclusion and diversity here at UK Fast. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. What's your reaction today in terms of these figures and how far they go? Do they go far enough?
I think, as we've heard, I think there's much more that can be done with regards to the figures and looking at specific roles. I think the exciting thing about it is that it continues to keep this conversation on very much top of the agenda. Internally here at UK Fast, we are very lucky that we have pay parity, we have leadership parity on our board, but that's not the case for our industry. So internally, we know that we need to do more in helping get more women into technical roles and then progress them through a leadership channel, and we've got internal structures to do that. But externally, we know that as part of a community that we need to get involved in some of the bigger initiatives that are going on here. Example, in Manchester, you've got the Combined Authority are now launching a new gender initiative to get 50-50 parity of women into tech by 2025, and we're very proud to be part of that. And we think that by doing things like that, by getting more women into tech and more women into leadership roles, that it will then in turn affect the gender pay gap. That's the problem that we're talking about today.
Now, obviously, your gender pay gap is very small. It's only 3% when it comes to comparing median role figures.
Yeah.
Why is that gap there, and is it something you're working on?
As I said, I think the challenge that we have as a business, we can always do more. So whilst at a senior leadership, we are representative men and women, where our areas that we can improve is our technical roles, and that's consistent right across the tech industry. It's an 80-20 split, men and women in technical roles as tech as an industry. So by investing more and doing more in the schools, by educating we've got a code club going on here for young children here today to open up women to the opportunity of technical roles, get them in through the technical channels, and then take them through leadership into the next level of their careers. OK,
Trish, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Let me just introduce you now to one of the employees here, Kat Bulfin, who used to be a midwife. She now works in the tech industry. Indeed, there's a lot of people here who have had jobs in other industries before they've come into the tech world. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. How have you found the comparison between working in healthcare to working in the tech world?
I guess from my experience, when I was a midwife, I was working in like a very female-dominated midwifery team, and I would have had been come up against quite a male-dominated doctor team, and I guess for me that made me feel like I was kind of up against walls sometimes. I really was driven and I wanted to have a lot of autonomy, and I felt like that wasn't really happening for me. So I made the change. I moved over to Manchester and I came to UK Fast. And that's where I've had a lot of responsibility given to me and respect, and I'd never regretted.
And just lastly, did you feel that you were valued differently to men in more senior roles in the hospital that you worked in?
I did feel like that. I felt like even though we had just as much responsibility looking after babies and their families, I felt like our say or our opinion sometimes it wasn't as respected as the male team that we were working with as well.
Kat, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. And just the latest figures for you as of this early afternoon, 9,228 companies have now filed their figures. 78% of those have a gender pay gap in favour of men, 13.7% in favour of women. And at the weekend, there was around a quarter that hadn't filed those figures. 1,000 have filed them in the last 24 hours, so many leaving it right up to the wire.
OK, Sally, thank you. Let's talk a bit more about this with Marianne Overton, who's a councillor on Lincolnshire County Council and is the most senior woman at the Local Government Association. Ms Overton, thank you for your time. Just interesting listening to the employees there, and there's very much a feeling about feeling valued at work, not just the pay. Is that what you think as well?
Yes, absolutely. This is about making sure that we're not wasting talent and skills. We have a whole population and we need to make sure that we listen to all the voices if we're going to be making the right decisions. And that's why it's absolutely critical that we value all of our employees and our councillors too, to make sure that we get the best out of them. So skills and talents are brought into public service, making it as good as it can be.
Do you think the government should have asked for a little bit more detail from companies? I know that businesses with more than 250 people, there are thousands of them, but it would have been helpful to have figures for hourly pay, standalone statistics like job, age breakdown, full-time, part-time. This is only a little bit of the picture.
It's a really good opener because it is a very clear and blunt instrument, but it's a clear one which gives everyone the opportunity to start the conversation. Certainly in my council, for example, we've had papers coming to the committee so that we can actually investigate, and we have asked for that background information, the more in-depth information, and that actually has been very revealing. But it has been the trigger of this statement that has actually brought people to the table to enable these discussions to go on. And I do think it's the right thing, and I think the results are interesting and some quite surprising.
And also about not just equal pay but equal opportunity. Some of the interesting things in the figures we've got so far is, of course, that at the very top end there are some women, but the majority men, and they are, if they're paid the same, usually it's a lot of money, but there's fewer women in those jobs.
That's very true, and there are a number of reasons for that, of course. But what's really important about this is that all of our organisations examine what they're doing, the way they recruit, examine the way they encourage and support their employees and their councillors to make sure that we are bringing people forward and giving them every opportunity to perform the very best they can. Britain needs the best, and we're getting the best out of people, and this is a really good start, a good way of opening that conversation and getting things moving.
OK, Marianne Overton, thanks for your time.
Taking companies to court, you'd have the state prosecuting them, presumably, because you want to impose fines, isn't that right?
Absolutely. For companies, organisations that do not produce their gender pay gap, they will be fined, like they do in Iceland. In Iceland, they fine their companies £355 a day, and we would adopt a very similar measure. But we'll put it all out to consultation whilst we're in opposition, ready for when we come into government. It's a good way to get organisations to look at what they're doing, to make sure they have fair practices, to make sure they're not paying bonuses to one group and not another. It's actually a fair way, a fairer way to operate and a better way to do business. And as I said, there'll be rewards. So those organisations will have access to lucrative government contracts. Billions of pounds goes out to organisations at the moment that we don't know how they operate. This way, it'll be a fair process and it will be transparent.
Yeah. And what sort of level would these fines be at?
Well, about £355 a day is what they do in Iceland. We would, at the moment, consider that. But if after consulting with businesses, they say it's too little or too much, then that's open for review and revision. So the whole thing will go out to consultation. But the key is this. So what we're saying is, we're going to put actions into place because we want to make the country work for more people. So we'll put actions into place, not just audits. You need more than audits. Audits isn't enough. I mean, even Maria Miller, who's chair of the Equality Select Committee, has said, you know, the EHRC, for instance, they don't have the resources to be truly effective because they've received 70% of their budget has been cut. So they don't have the resources to do anything other than maybe, you know, tell organisations off a little bit.
The Prime Minister has vowed to tackle the gender pay gap, Theresa May describing the difference in earnings between men and women as a burning injustice. The UK's biggest companies have until midnight to disclose their figures. If they don't meet the deadline, they could be threatened with legal action and an unlimited fine. Let's talk about this a bit more with Sky's Sally Lockwood, live in Manchester for us at the headquarters of tech company UK Fast. What's their gender pay gap looking like, Sally?
Well, Tom, this company is one of more than 9,000 that's had to publish their gender pay gap figures by midnight tonight. And we've seen quite a mad rush, actually, to meet this deadline. At the weekend, nearly a quarter of those companies hadn't published those figures, and we've seen more than 1,000 publish them in the last 24 hours. Now, of the figures that we've seen published so far, 78% has a gender pay gap in favour of men, 13% in favour of women, and 8% have no gender pay gap at all. But as some of these companies have tried to justify and explain their figures, for instance, Ryanair and EasyJet have explained that there's such a big gender pay gap in their companies because more men are in the higher paying roles, namely as pilots. And even in this company, which has a 0% gender pay gap at baseline salary, it's still rather nuanced in terms of which figures you look at. And with me now is Jonathan Bowers, the MD, who's here to explain a little bit more about it. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Now, as I said there, it really does depend on which figures you look at, because when you include shift workers, you do have a pay gap. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. So our baseline gender pay gap is 0. But when you look at shift work, which for us a shift allowance is related to some of the more technical roles, those roles are mostly filled by men within this business, it means that it creeps up from 0 to 0.9%.
And why is that men fill the shift work roles?
Quite simply because they're the types of roles that men are more attracted to. They're technical roles within a data centre, very hands-on, and we're working very hard within the industry at the moment to try and get more women into roles like that and show an interest in them. And that's starting to have an effect. We have some young apprentices now who may go into some of those roles in the next year or so, female apprentices, which will help to shift that balance.
So 0.9% still very, very small, but then when you look at the median figures, it goes to 3%. So can you try and explain that?
That's right. OK, so the government are asking for an interesting set of numbers, and the median itself is, for me, an easier number to present, but a much less useful number. The median is taking the middle employee, the salary of the middle employee, male and female, and comparing those salaries. Now, to me, it's a bit of a nonsense to try and actually get a parity there, because they might be in completely different kinds of roles as well. What the mean does, the mean takes the average of all the female salaries, the average of all the male salaries, and compares the two. And that's the one that's much more useful, perhaps a more difficult number to come to, but much more useful in terms of finding out whether there's a gender pay disparity in whichever area, whether it's a high-paid role or a low-paid role.
And in light of that, how useful do you think this exercise is of publishing and revealing gender pay gap figures in this way?
I think it's useful to start the conversation, but I genuinely feel that if we're going to do this properly, we need to look at like-for-like roles. We need to look at whether a female doctor or a female engineer is paid the same as a male doctor or engineer with the same experience levels and the same longevity within a business, for instance. Those things are really going to tell us where there's unfair pay going on.
And what's your reaction to the figures that we've seen? You know, some companies have a gender pay gap of 95%.
I'm very surprised at some of the extremely high gender pay gaps. I'm surprised at some of the comments being made about why the pay gaps are so high, because it's in every business's ability and responsibility to try and change those things around. We've actually gone to the lengths of starting our first school in the years to come, secondary school, in order to inspire young people, male and female, to get into technology for the future, to allow a bigger pool of people to choose from. Other businesses, other industries need to be thinking in similar ways in order to widen their pool from which they can recruit.
OK, Jonathan Bowers, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us today. And as you see there is very much a welcomed interest in terms of seeing these figures published today, but there's still a long way to go. Many saying that these figures don't reveal equal pay. They don't compare like-for-like salaries for men and women doing the same job. So still a long way to go, as it appears, looking at these figures, but today's deadline of midnight is still a very important first step.
Get first. So the fact that we have now finally got all these statistics down, and women know how much, they're being done out of cash-wise. Over the course of an average woman's working lifetime, that is the cost of a house. You know, we are being done out of a house by our employers. I'd like to go further with this. I'd like to have it all backdated. I'd like us to go work out how much we haven't been paid over the years and then have a big chunky settlement. That would change the nature of the economy if women suddenly had all this money sloshing around.